I'd like to welcome everyone to the webinar series of the Cybersecurity and Information Systems Information Analysis Center, CSIAC. Today's presentation is entitled Applying the Top 20 Critical Controls for Risk Assessment. My name is Steve Warzala. I'm the CSIAC Outreach Manager. A few administrative notes before we begin. First, all phones have been muted except for the presenters. Questions may be asked at any time during the presentation by utilizing the chat function. Time permitting, your questions will be answered at the end of the session. Today's briefing slides will be posted on our website within a few days. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our sponsor, the Defense Technical Information Center, DTIC. The funding that DTIC provides enables CSIAC to conduct these webinars. CSIAC is currently participating in the National Cybersecurity Awareness Month campaign. Each week in October has emphasized a different theme. This week, the focus is on careers in the cybersecurity field. Given that particular emphasis, it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Dr. Andrew Hurd. Andy is the Faculty Program Director for Cybersecurity at Excelsior College. He is responsible for curriculum development and degree requirements for the bachelor's and master's degrees in cybersecurity. Excelsior has been designated a National Center of Academic Excellence in Cyber Defense Education by both the National Security Agency and the Department of Homeland Security. Dr. Hurd previously worked at Hudson Valley Community College and the State University of New York, Albany. Andy holds dual Bachelor of Arts in Computer Science and Mathematics, a Master's in Science of Teaching Mathematics, and a PhD in Information Sciences specialized in Information Assurance and Online Learning. He won the SUNY Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching in 2012 while working at HVCC. I will now turn the presentation over to Dr. Hurd. Good afternoon, Andy. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Steve, and welcome, everyone. I hope that this webinar is very informational and helps you understand the critical controls and how they can be applied. When we talk about the top 20 critical controls, they were originally created by SANS, but now they're housed by CIS. Near Albany, New York. They are very dominant controls, and they are used to help people understand compliance. So if you deal with compliance on a daily basis, the 20 critical controls will definitely help you do your job. It will help your company understand where their weaknesses are, and it will help you make informed decisions on how to spend money. Now, from a career standpoint, the 20 critical controls, every time I've talked to employers lately, they talk about the 20 critical controls because they're implementing them throughout their business, and it's becoming a dominant framework for people to use. So I want to let everyone know that this information can be found on the CISsecurity.org under the controls. I put this information together, and I think it's the way I approach it, I hope you will enjoy it. I identify what the critical controls are. They're a recommended set of actions. In 2008, the NSA noted that they're part of the defense posture. And if the NSA is promoting something, most of the time, the NSF is following closely behind, and that's where a lot of the money comes from for cybersecurity education and cybersecurity grants to help companies become more secure. As we all know, you can't go on the internet or open a newspaper or read any place without a cyber incident happening. So one of the things the critical controls do is it will help your company identify its risk posture, which to most informed managers is extremely important. There are several different areas that the critical controls can be used in. and they have been part of many other organizations in their mappings. So NIST has mapped the risk management and the security controls, has become a dominating force when it comes to security controls. The CIS controls, the 20 critical controls, have been mapped to the ISO standards, to the cybersecurity framework, HIPAA, FISMA. All the major business entities are using some type of standard, and these 20 critical controls can be mapped to them. And at the bottom of the slide, I put this on there. It serves as a basis for immediate high-value action. What I mean by that is, if your company is evaluating the 20 critical controls and they're looking at their compliance level, if they identify that they're not compliant in a certain area, then it actually gives them the ability to develop an action plan on how to become compliant and to what level of compliance they want to be. The 20 critical controls are by no means the solution to everything, but they really help a company understand where they're weak in areas, where they're strong in other areas, and what level of compliance do they want to get to. So why else should people care? It's all about compliance. To what level does your company need to be compliant? That's kind of a trick question, because it really depends on the area you're dealing with. But if you're dealing with PII, any personal identifiable information, most companies want to be as compliant as possible, because there's always a monetary component of being compliant. It helps you stand up in the court of law if there's a breach and you have to justify how you handled the breach and what your actions were. Your company has to ask the questions, what's the cost of being compliant? It could be expensive to be compliant. There are some steps that really take into consideration the best practices, right? So when you're looking at the best practices, that's not the cheapest practices, it's the best practices. So there could be some cost occurrence there. What is the return on being compliant? Well, most of the time it's assurance and security and peace of mind for your company. The controls are put in place for a reason, and as we go through them, I hope you understand as we look at them. And the biggest question is, what's the cost of not being compliant? If you're not compliant, you're accepting risk. There's a acceptable amount of loss. I was talking with a group of colleagues recently, and we're talking about ransomware. And I asked each of them, I said, how many of you have a backup plan for your home information? And they kind of all looked at me with, big white eyes, like, with a deer in headlights. And I said, are you susceptible to a ransomware attack? And they said, well, why do I have to worry about it at home? And I said, well, if you're not compliant, or if you're okay with losing your information at home, then don't worry about it. Don't worry about a backup plan. So for companies not being compliant, there's a big risk there. So what is risk management? Here's two standard definitions I grabbed off the internet. I did not make these up. The forecasting and evaluation of financial risk together with the identification of procedures. Okay, that's the standard definition. Or you can go the business definition, the identification, analysis, asset control, and avoidance, minimization, and elimination of acceptable risks. Acceptable risks, that could be another whole webinar, I'm sure. When we look at the acceptable risks and how much of a risk taker you are, really boils down to informed decisions, right? If you look at what acceptable is, what's acceptable to me may not be acceptable to you. What's acceptable to my organization may not be acceptable to your organization. Therefore, this generates a really difficult topic in standardizations. So having frameworks helps companies identify their best possible course of actions. So why use the controls? It's a best-in-class threat data and to transform actionable guidance. It gives you the ability to create action plans. It helps your company identify its weaknesses. It also identifies their strengths. It can be used for marketing. Companies can say what level of compliance they are to the critical controls. And as they become more predominant in the industry, more and more people can say, hey, if you're ISO 2000 or 27000 compliant, and you're meeting all the standards of that whole ISO family, then you should be pretty high on the critical control level too, which is true, but there's no, I'll say there's no gold star for it, right? It's an internal auditing tool. So this is a interesting scenario, because as the industry identifies the use of the critical controls, then it means something to people you're going to do business with. And I think that's really important. So here's the beginning of the 20 critical controls. And hopefully you've seen these before. If you haven't seen them before, like I said, they're on the CIS website. So I've seen these in different orders. This just happens to be the order that I chose them, the current listing. But I identified a keyword off to the right, and you can see that. The keyword is the action, right? So if I have an inventory of authorized or unauthorized devices, I want to actively maintain that inventory. So if you go down through the keywords, I'm going to show you the definitions of these critical controls, and I've highlighted these keywords. Malware defense, the keyword is control. Are you going to block all malware? Are you going to stop all malware that comes into your company? The answer is probably no. You're probably not going to be able to stop everything if you're on the internet at all. So the best thing to do is to be able to control the outcomes of what happens when the malware gets into your system. So there's your first 10. Here's your next 10. And notice, like on 17, security skills assessment and appropriate training to fill gaps. Prioritizing. I talk to people constantly about who should be trained at your company and what levels they should be trained at. So prioritize that training, prioritize the learning. I know two-factor authentication works at our company, at our college. We use that all the time. We have access codes, we have key fobs. There's all sorts of things, and we're constantly trained on them, which is great because it's not just the managers that are trained, it's even the custodians that are trained on it. So under the data protection, number 13, the keyword is prevent. Prevent any loss. You have to look at data protection in its entirety. It's not just encryption. Okay, so if we look at the definition, here's the inventory of authorized and unauthorized devices. Actively manage all hardware devices on the network so that the only authorized devices are given access. This is extremely difficult with the Internet of Things. I was talking to our CISO the other day, and he's wearing an Apple Watch. And I said, hey, is that registered? And he goes, yes, I registered it. And I said, okay. I said, what about all the other IoT devices on campus? And the way they register them is they have to log into the network. And as they log in, then they actually get tracked. So that's important. Inventory of authorized or unauthorized software. Oh, this is a good one. A lot of times people just want to install, new software. And this is a big issue right now when most things can be run through websites. Right, people each day, run Spotify through the web, the web page. It's like the new torrent, right? It's using those technologies. So actively maintain all software in the network. This helps you identify what needs to be patched, what needs to be updated. This is extremely important when you're trying to plan out a budget and see when software is going to be deprecated or when new software is going to be needed. So secure config for hardware and software and mobile devices. There's a very interesting scenario with this. It says actively manage. at our school, we came across an issue where I had a Macintosh computer and I needed to update to the newest operating system because there were some security patches. But if I did, my connection to a certain database at the school would no longer work. So I actually had to roll back the update so that I could actually do my work remotely. This is a security issue. So how do you handle that? So you have to actively manage it. You have to make sure things are being tracked, and you should have a control log. So continuous vulnerability assessment, continuously acquire, assess, and take action on new information. Does your company actually go out to the CVE? Does it go look at the vulnerability exploitation database to look to make sure that your control management, that's a good question, Raphael. Going through control management, I think, is extremely important. But there's this amount of training that goes to that. So that's something that you have to take into consideration. So control the use of administrative privileges. Wow. Practice least privilege. I cannot stress that enough in a company. Making sure that that you look at how somebody tracks, controls, prevents. I agree with the comment that was just made. This is difficult to continuously do this and to continuously do all the 20 critical controls because there's a cost to it. The one thing that I've said time and time again over the past couple of years is that security is not easy, right? It takes a lot of effort to be compliant, and that's what we're looking at. So your maintenance, monitoring, and analysis of audit logs. How often do you do auditing? Is it once a year, once a month, once every, deemed amount of time? Collect, manage, and analyze those audit logs. A lot of people are trying to automate this process. They're going in and they're looking to see how many outliers there are, how many incidents there might be. Well, if anything, if we can learn from anything, we can learn from the prior vulnerabilities that have happened and the breaches that have happened, that most of the time the incidents are ongoing for months before they're identified. So I think we can do a real good job to update and manage this. I think it's important. Email and web browser protections. Minimize the attack surface. Do you have your email on your cell phone for your work? Do you have your email on other devices? If you're using Office 365, are you sharing that information across multiple platforms? There's a lot of different things that you really have to pay attention to with the minimize part. Attackers, they want to get in. They're going to do the social engineering. They're going to try and grab anything they can to identify a hole in the environment. So malware defense, like I said, control the installation. Don't let unauthorized people install things on their computers. I think that's really important. I think you can maintain and control this through a help desk. People can push out information. That becomes extremely important. The help desk can actually maintain and update systems. And even if it's something you want personally on your desktop, putting in a ticket, making sure the help desk is aware that you're installing it, goes all the way back to number 2, right? It goes back to registering that there's an installed software on your system. And if that is registered someplace, then there's a update process for it. There's a patching plan that can be put in place. So that's important. Limitation to control of network ports. Many people put networks in, and this is a lot for the small companies, right? The people who just put in the default networks with the default protocols, and they don't change the default passwords on things. So track, control, correct the ongoing operational use, right? I think that's really, 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 big. And I agree, small companies do have a hard time doing this. And it's not that they have a hard time. Most of the time, they don't have the resources for it. A person has the idea that they want to form a small company, they want to be online, they want to have a website, they want to have a database, they want to have online ordering, and there's a lot of things going on there. They need an IT specialist, now they need a cybersecurity specialist, they need someone to protect their data. So that's really important. Data recovery capabilities, timely. What is your cost of being down? What is your return to operations, your RTOs? What is your MTD, your mandatory time for defense? When we look at this, the recover possibility, every time or every minute a company's system is down, they're probably losing money or they're losing productivity. So the data recovery capabilities, extremely important. One of the funny things I just read recently is that a company may do this well. They may make backups each day. They may ship them off site on tapes. And it was really funny because they were talking about how meticulous the tapes were being labeled and what server that they were being backed up, the backup capability and all that type of stuff. And then they talked about what if someone breaks into the warehouse and they can get all the data from the warehouse and it's all meticulously labeled. Therefore, people have the ability to steal information or identify information they're looking to steal quicker. So actively manage network devices, secure configurations, make sure the right people are doing the right job. Make sure audit logs are being checked. Make sure the security configuration is being updated. This is extremely important. Boundary defenses. Detect, prevent, correct the flow of information transferring networks of different trust levels. Wow, trust levels is a great talk. Who has the trust in your company? And how do you identify trust levels when you get a disgruntled employee? So this boundary defense is really important when we're looking at the longevity of information within the company, right? It's not only keeping people out, but it's also identifying the issues from, like, let's say, an insider threat. If we use the policy of least privilege, then we can keep people contained. I think that's important. And when you're doing security damaging, it's a difficult time. So data protection, the process and tools used to prevent data exfiltration. I hear people all the time say, I have a virus protection software. I'm safe from all antivirus. Or I use a Mac. I don't have to worry about data protection. There's a lot of things that people can be educated on. And just because you use one type of platform over another doesn't mean that it's more, it's less likely there will be incidents, but it doesn't mean that it's secure. Always take those measures, always encrypt your data, always save it in a off-site location, replicate it, make sure that you have the ability to ensure the CIA triangle, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Extremely important when we're talking about data protection. So the control access base, the need to know. Those of you who are working for the federal government, this is a big one, right? All data is on a need to know basis, track, control, prevent, or correct. I find this, the last part, the correct is the issue when it comes to control access based, because it takes a while for data to be corrected. It takes a while for machines to be corrected if there's issues. And if it's taking time, then there's actually going to be costs associated with it. Now, at Excelsior College, when we look at these critical controls, we actually have a master's class that's aligned to this, to using the 20 critical controls and really understanding them. It's a risk management course. we send our students through case studies and scenarios on how to actually analyze all these critical controls as they're applied to a company. I think that's extremely important. If you're doing this in the industry, or you want to move into a job that's doing this in the industry, I suggest you practice this. I suggest you go out and look, and there's several places on the internet where you can find case studies, and you can try to apply the critical controls to them and see what the compliance level is going to be. So, wireless access control, the Internet of Things has blown this up. It's really, really, really difficult to make sure that all access points are secure. All devices that are coming in are fully patched, maintained, updated. But more importantly, that the wireless access controls are strong and they're doing their job properly. So account monitoring and control. A lot of people put a network in place and then fail to monitor it. They say, okay, I trust my employees. I agree. Trust is a huge part of having dedicated employees, but there still needs to be someone there looking, actively managing the life cycle of the system, looking, making sure that updates are going to be done, making sure that people are staying in the areas of the networks that they're supposed to be in. I once upon a time worked with a person who was doing packet sniffing on the network just because no one was yelling at him because he was doing it. And I said to him one day, I said, "Why are you doing this?" He goes, "Well, I want to see how far I can take this." Right? He was a trusted employee. He was a vice president in the company. In the IT department, once they identified it, they didn't do anything because he was a vice president. Well, even if he's a vice president, he didn't have the rights and privileges to be doing that. So that's something to actively monitor the system. Security skills assessment, appropriate training. Wow, this is, prioritizing. I said this earlier, making sure people are trained. This is extremely important when we talk about how to handle risk assessment. The skills assessment. When you accept a job at a company or you go into a company, do they give you a skills assessment on your cybersecurity knowledge? Just because you have an industry certification in an area, I still think you should be tested on it. I still think they should verify that you still have retained that knowledge. If you're doing this as part of the critical controls, then everyone is being tested on their knowledge. Everyone's being trained. And if you have an older certification, there's nothing wrong with updating your skills. It's really important that everyone be, aware of cyber incidents, that information is shared quickly. And I know a lot of companies that are doing internal social engineering attacks. They're doing spoofing to see if they can trick their employees into falling for false emails. And if so, if someone clicks on them, they automatically get enrolled in a new training class. That's one way that you can make sure that people have the appropriate skills. So application software security, this goes way back. I'd like to say that this is, the heart and soul of the critical controls as a former software engineer myself. But this goes back to how students in colleges are being taught how to program. Because if they understand the security lifecycle, then they're implementing security from the beginning. They're not looking at adding security on as an afterthought. And if that's the case, then managing the security lifecycle becomes really important and really easy because the security controls are built in. So any in-house developed software must have the security up front. I think that is, really, really, really strong and important. So the incident response team, what is the incident response plan? How are we going to respond? How are we going to look at what's happened? Is it an incident or is it a vulnerability? Is it an attack? If we're going to prioritize this, how are we going to protect the organization's information? All incidents, should be logged. All attacks definitely should be responded to. and all company breaches have to be reported within 30 days. That's the new standard that's being put out. So I think it's important that the company understands this and they get the team ready, right? It's just because you have a security breach and you've identified this, okay? So with this critical control, if we identify that there's a breach, then we can go to the incident response plan and we can make sure that we have somebody who's ready to address the media. We have someone who's ready to address the internal stakeholders. We have somebody who's ready to address the board if that needs to be done. And we're trying to mitigate the issues and I'll say the rippling effect of having a breach. Right now, it's frowned upon if a company has a breach. But we really should start rewarding companies who are reporting these breaches that help other companies stop themselves from having breaches. So that infrastructure is extremely important. So penetration testing, red team exercises, blue team exercises. Most of the time, companies do not think about this. But there are many companies out there that hire out for penetration testing. So test the overall strength of an organization's defense. This goes all the way back, and you can think about each one of the other critical controls. Which ones are you worried about? If you're worried about your network, if you're worried about vulnerability scanning, if you're worrying about that type of stuff, then you probably should hire out to a penetration testing company and have them test your outside network. I've seen this with competitions in colleges. They're doing a lot of these red team, blue team exercises. They're teaching young, I don't want to say young, but they're teaching learners how to handle breaches, how to respond to those breaches, how to patch, how to fix the holes. And I think this is an important part that's coming from the penetration testing side that is happening in colleges. So here's a link. You're welcome to go to it. It will send you to the 20 critical controls. I would highly recommend that if you have any interest in the critical controls and how they apply to you, to read through these notes again. As Steve said, that these slides will be made available. You will have my contact information soon. You'll have other contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out and ask questions. So yeah, you can't click on the URL right now until you actually get the slides, but I did put it in there for you. So I'd like to thank you. I tried to keep it to 30, 35 minutes to make sure that we had plenty of time for comments and questions. Myself as faculty program director, I'm extremely excited about this topic. I teach it all the time. I talk to different colleagues at conferences about it. I think companies, this is a great place for companies to start if they don't know how to analyze their cybersecurity posture, is that they can run through the 20 critical controls, and there's a lot of spreadsheets out on the internet that will help you determine what compliance level you're at. We use several of them in our risk management class. We allow students to analyze a company or several companies and do comparisons on what company is doing more than the other. And it also helps managers make informed decisions. So I think this is a great place to stop. I'll be happy to answer any questions. I've seen a few of them go through the attendee chat.
Yep. Yeah. That was a good presentation, Andrew, and the topic definitely generated a lot of comments, questions on our chat board there. We had an active crew participating today, so appreciate that. So I did capture some of the questions, so I'll throw a few at you and try and get some answers for our audience members.
Okay.
So let's see. One of the early questions was regarding, being compliant. There was a question about is the return for being compliant? Is there a numerical score that you actually get when you go through that process? How does that
It really depends on your company, right? If you're going to look at the cost or your compliance level, it's actually based out of 100%. So each one of the critical controls, you'll have a compliance level, let's say at 70%. So if you're 70%, and I'm going to go all the way back here, I'm going to go back to the list, so I can give you an example. So if we look at, sorry, I overclicked here. So if we look at the first control, so the inventory of authorized and unauthorized devices, if I know everything that's in my company, all my devices that are in my company are tracked and being logged, then I'm probably at 100% compliance level. Well, what does 100% compliance level do for me with unauthorized devices or authorized and unauthorized devices? It allows me to put in place a replacement plan, when things should be updated. I can look at my servers. I can see when they're going to need updating. When, if the company's providing, let's say, cell phones, when does the contract end? All that type of stuff is all inventoried. So if I'm 100% compliance on this first control, then I can actually make some informed decisions and some budget planning on my hardware budget.
Okay, so great. So there was another question that we had was, does the risk management process actually assess the risk of missing a risk, missing a vulnerability? Does that taken into account? Is that factored in the process?
Yeah, when you're dealing with risk management, there's only so much risk that you can identify. And then there's always that, I'll say, that gray area. It's the unknown. It's the risk you haven't thought about. A lot of times, if we look at the Target breach, okay, Target's systems themselves were secure, but their risk was the third-party software, right? The third-party software had the vulnerability, which allowed people into the Target system. So they didn't have a CISO, they didn't have a security officer, and people weren't made aware that the third-party vendor had a vulnerability. So there's always going to be that risk that you just don't know. But the risk management process is supposed to help you identify as many risks as possible and then put together a reaction plan. So how to recover from that risk. There's no way to mitigate 100% of risk. There's just no way. There's no way that you're ever going to stop every possible disaster, because there's risks that people don't even consider in the human side. What if, let's say, the network engineer gets extremely sick and they're going to be out for months? Is there a replacement for that person? Because you can't just outright fire that person, but you don't have anyone doing the network maintenance, let's say if there's just one person. So that's a risk a lot of people don't think about, having a sick employee.
Yeah, and sometimes, in organizations, especially, small ones, you've got that kind of one key individual that, has the awareness and insight into the system, and if he's not around, you've got problems. So yeah.
Yeah, Michelle just put something in the chat box that I would like to address: the 0-day exploit. There's things we just don't know that's out there yet, right? It hasn't happened. It's something new. And if you're talking about the critical controls and risk management, how do you plan for something you don't know? There is no way. So there's always going to be a 0-day exploit, as much as we want to try. So. Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. So I think the other thing to note is that the top 20 critical security controls are actually addressing threats that we know about. These are addressing the known threats, correct?
Yeah, this is when you're going through these 20 critical controls, you're looking at your company system, right? So these are things that you can identify within your system and within your company. It's not what's not in your company that you don't know about. Does that make sense?
Right. Yep. Let's see. We had a question about one of our attendees was asking why would you use risk management rather than the principle of system integrity as it's in the theory of constraints? Do you have any comment on that question?
Yeah, actually I do. The system integrity can be fooled. Okay, not saying that the 20 critical controls can't be fooled, because sometimes if you don't pay attention to them, you'll have issues. But system integrity, it's something I'm actually working with right now, looking at how, let's say, nuclear power plants are being attacked. So when we look at that, if it's a passive attack and people are just in there looking around, what has broken down with the integrity? Pretty much nothing. But when we go back, if I got in through a passive attack, then there's probably some type of firewall log. There's probably some type of intrusion detection system. And if I'm monitoring the 20 critical controls, that will come forward. But if I'm just looking at the integrity of the system, I'm not really doing anything detrimental to the system, so I would have a harder time identifying the issue.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for answering that one, Andy.
No problem. That's a good one.
So we did, and there was a question asking about using code protection as well as data protection. Do you have any comment, insight on that inquiry?
Did you say co or code?
Code.
Yeah, that's one of those things that depends on the actual software, right? Code protection can be done in multiple ways. A lot of times the output of any type of code or any type of software, hopefully you're encrypting, hopefully you're storing it and you're monitoring it. So I think there's a lot of different ways to address that issue.
Okay. We had another question from our audience regarding software and how does that get authorized?
Say that again? I'm sorry, I missed it.
It was the question was, how does software get authorized?
So if you want software to get authorized within a company, then you need to go to your IT component of the company and actually have them evaluate the software to see if there's any known issues with that software and your current platform. If there isn't, then there's probably a pretty good possibility that the software can be authorized, and then it can be put into the, I'll say, the updated spreadsheet or list for upgrades and patches. So the authorized software will definitely be, I'll say, given a gold star by your IT department, saying that it's going to work nicely with your network.
Okay, so that's more of an internal process within the company that your IT folks give it the blessing to use.
Correct.
Use a particular. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so now we get to the topic of continuously monitoring that generated a lot of comments. So it was a question of how is that defined? Who defines it? And I guess I'd wonder if you have any particular recommendation of what's a reasonable definition of that.
Yeah, continuously monitoring. Um, uh, there are so many log files generated from a normal network that it becomes pretty cumbersome to actually get through all the log files on a given day to analyze things. I have several friends who are network defense people and network administrators, and they write batch files and they do all sorts of other type of analysis on network traffic on a daily basis. So they actually look at the firewall logs. You know, I have a friend who he says they get about 60,000 attacks a day. So how do you go through and see, you know, which attacks are actually valid on a continuous basis? So the key is to automate everything, to put thresholds on alerts, to say that if the process happens so many times, then they're actually going to generate some type of alert that the network engineer or network administrator can actually act upon. Most of the time, that threshold level is not easy to identify. So as far as continuously goes, it's one of those definitions that you'll have to come up with inside your company.
Okay. Once again, it's based on each individual organization has to kind of come up with what works best for them.
Correct.
Okay. Let's see. There was a question about bring your own devices, and does the registration process include that, and are there policies for what happens when a device of that type gets lost?
Oh, there should be a policy for what happens if that device gets lost. There should be a policy for bring your own devices. Everything that I've been talking about as part of a policy should be your information assurance policy for your company, which goes into a lot of different depths. I'm not going to go into it here, but there should be I'll say an IoT registration, right? So if you're bringing a device into your company and you're going to connect it to any type of data or network that your company provides, then that device needs to be registered and it needs to be known. If that data or if that device gets lost, then that's an incident, right? There's a possibility loss of data, and there's a possibility breach into your system, because someone can pick up that device, and if you have the remember me flag turned on or whatever, and someone just logs in to the systems, then they don't have the security check in place because that device is registered. So it's very important that if an employee loses a device, they don't say, well, I hope it turns up in a day or two. No, they need to let the IT system or directors know, the CISO know immediately, so that they can turn off access to the device until it's found.
Okay, great. I'll also make a note that I think back in the spring, I want to, if my memory serves me, I want to say it was our March webinar. We actually did a webinar on a topic called Comply to Connect, and that topic did address knowing knowing your system, knowing what devices are on your system, and maintaining awareness of that. So if you've got interest in that topic, that Comply to Connect webinar may be a valuable resource for you to go back and take a look at. All the webinars are recorded and posted on our website, so if you're interested, you can go back and check that one out. So
Steve,
let's see.
there looks like there's a question from the live YouTube stream.
Yep, I was just going to get to that. Go.
How does an independent test team test for weaknesses in the SDLC?
Yep.
That's an interesting question. Are you testing the software after it's been created, so the commercial software, or are you testing internally? If you're testing commercially made software, then the only thing you can really test is how it interacts with your system and where you're going to house it on your system. So you want to make sure that it's in the securest environment as possible. If you're actually doing in-house software development and you want to do independent testing for the SDLC weaknesses, then you're doing unit testing. You're doing module testing. You're doing this comes with experience in having a trained software engineer on the best coding practices. So I think that's really important to address up front and make sure that the team is on the same level. It doesn't hurt that if you have a senior developer that they hold small training classes for younger developers and teach them the proper coding standards and how to implement that. So if you want to test for a weakness, you can send the commercial software through all sorts of product tests. And I would recommend that before you bring it in or before you agree to use them as part of a partnership. I think that's really important, and I don't think it's done enough. I think people just see a business need, they see a software that meets that need, and then they go on and jump in feet first without knowing whether or not that other software has any type of major vulnerabilities.
So just following up on that, Andy, Michelle made a comment that the software assurance maturity model may assist with SDLC. Do you have any? Are you familiar with that model, and do you have any comment on that?
No, I'm very familiar with that, and I agree with you, Michelle. I think the software maturity models definitely apply to the SDLC. They definitely can apply to something that a lot of companies don't do internally is code checks. Having people check each other's code, which helps with that software maturity levels.
Okay, thank you. Jack had a question, and he was wondering if non-functional testing, similar to what's used for hardware, could that be useful for software as well?
Oh, Jack, that's a good question. I would say it would depend on the software, and it depends on what the software is attempting to do. Most of the time, non-functional testing, when you're testing hardware, you're just testing for connectivity, and you're testing for usability, right? So if we're looking at non-functional testing, does the hardware actually work? Not that it actually performs the actions you want it to do. Does it just functionally work for what it's designed to do? So if I just asked if the software does what it's supposed to do, I don't think that's enough. I think we really want to check the inputs and the outputs, and we want to make sure that there's no buffer overflow possibilities. We want to make sure that the input is being checked and the output is being stored and encrypted and that type of stuff. So I think there are components of it, but I don't think it can be used in its entirety.
So Jack also included a comment below that Professor Dykstra comments that the testing shows the presence but not the absence of bugs. So I'll make another plug for one of our CSIAC products here. We just our most recent journal are focused actually on the design and development process for creating assured software, so that the software does what you want it to do, and doesn't do things that you don't want it to do. So once again, it's not it's hard to make everything 100%, but there are the techniques in there that you follow. If you follow those, you're going to produce better software. It's going to be more functionally doing the things you wanted to do and minimizing those negative possibilities. So once again, that's you can find the journal on our website, and we'll be publishing a second volume on that. That's actually going to look at the tools and testing techniques for assured software. So we kind of did a little focused focus there on the software assurance aspect, and those articles were written by members from the DoD software assurance community of practice. So we had some really high quality individuals contributing white papers to those technical articles to those journals. So maybe you can if you're interested in that, you can check those out too. So we're getting to the end of our time here for today's webinar, as you see. So I just want to take a couple minutes to wrap up. There were a lot of questions, a lot of interest. If we didn't have time to get to your question, I would mention that we do have the technical forum on our website. You can go there and answer your question or ask your questions. Possibly we can twist Andy's arm into to respond to some of your inquiries, and we'll, like I said, just wanted to mention the technical forum. Andy, I wanted to thank you for taking the time, out of your busy schedule to do this webinar for us and share the information with our audience members. I appreciate that, and once again, thanks for agreeing to do this for us. It was a very informative session.
No problem. I was happy to be here, actually, and as part of Excelsior College, one of our goals is to promote cybersecurity education and awareness. So I think this is a good venue, and I hope it was helpful to people. I will check into the news groups, the discussion boards, and lend some answers to questions if I can, or point you in the right direction if I don't know the answer.
That's awesome. Greatly appreciate that. So like I said, if folks, if you didn't get your question answered, if you asked a